Jack Miller wiped sweat from his brow as he adjusted the settings on his field scanner. The twin sons of Draconis Prime beat down on his research station, a collection of prefab modules nestled at the edge of a vast golden plain. For 3 years he'd lived alone on this frontier world, documenting the incredible creatures that roamed its surface. Most fascinating were the beings locals called dragons, not the fire-breathing monsters of Earth legend, but intelligent reptilian creatures standing taller than horses, with iridescent scales that shimmered blue and green in the sunlight. Jack had spent countless hours observing them from a distance. They moved in herds like Earth's bison, yet displayed complex social behaviors more akin to wolves or dolphins. That morning had begun like any other. Jack was cataloging plant samples when his perimeter alarm beeped. Something large approached from the east. Grabbing his binoculars, he climbed to the station's roof and froze at the sight. A group of dragons, at least 30 strong, moved deliberately toward his camp. "They've never come this close before," he muttered, heart racing. In 3 years, the dragons had always kept their distance, watching him with obvious curiosity but clear wariness. Jack considered retreating inside, sealing the doors. Instead, scientific curiosity won out. He climbed down and stood in the open, making himself visible but non-threatening. The herd stopped 100 yards away. After what seemed like silent communication, a single dragon stepped forward, larger than the others, with faded scales showing great age. The matriarch, Jack realized. He'd observed her leading hunting parties and settling disputes within the herd. "Hello there," Jack said softly, knowing they couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone conveyed peaceful intentions. The matriarch approached slowly, her massive clawed feet leaving deep impressions in the soil. Jack stood his ground despite every instinct screaming to run from the 12-foot predator. When she stopped 20 feet away, he noticed something unexpected in her amber eyes. Not aggression, but desperation. She lowered her head and made a low trilling sound. Then, with deliberate movements, she turned and gestured with her tail toward the herd. Jack squinted, noticing for the first time that something was wrong. The herd carried no young dragons. Not a single juvenile among them. The matriarch approached again, this time extending one wing slightly. Balanced carefully on it was an object that glinted in the sunlight. With surprising gentleness, she set it on the ground between them. Jack approached cautiously. It was an egg roughly the size of a football, but something was wrong. Instead of the vibrant blue-green he'd documented in his research, this egg was mottled with patches of inky black. Understanding dawned on him. These apex predators, creatures who had dominated this ecosystem for millions of years, were facing something they couldn't fight with claws or teeth. Their young were dying, and in their desperation, they turned to the strange alien creature with his mysterious tools. "You want my help," Jack whispered, meeting the matriarch's gaze. "You're losing your children." The matriarch made another trilling sound, lower this time, almost like a moan. Behind her, the herd shifted restlessly, some dragons appearing ready to flee at the slightest provocation. Jack realized what this approach must have cost them, not just physical risk but the swallowing of evolutionary pride. These weren't just animals. They were intelligent beings making a desperate choice to trust an unknown entity. Jack knelt and carefully picked up the egg. It was warm against his palms but not as warm as it should be. Something was definitely wrong inside. He looked up at the massive dragon towering over him, a creature who could tear him apart in seconds, and nodded slowly. "I'll try," he said. "I can't promise anything but I'll try." The matriarch's eyes seemed to study him, searching for something. Then she backed away, rejoining her herd. They didn't leave, instead settling onto the plains a respectful distance from his station. Waiting. Watching. Jack carried the egg into his lab, mind already racing through possibilities. He was just one man, alone on an alien world, with equipment designed for basic research, not saving an entire species. But as he set the egg in his scanner and began the first of what would be thousands of tests, Jack knew one thing for certain. His quiet life of observation had just become something far more important. Two different worlds had just collided, and neither would ever be the same. The next morning, Jack woke to find 3 more dragon elders waiting outside his research station. These older dragons had distinctive scarring on their scales, likely badges of honor from past battles. They carried more eggs, each showing various stages of the strange black infection. "Okay, I get it," Jack said, carefully taking the eggs. "This is happening to all of them." Communication was the first major hurdle. The dragons couldn't speak, at least not in any way Jack recognized as language. Instead, they used a combination of body postures, tail movements and low-frequency rumbles that Jack could feel more than hear. One elder with a jagged scar running down his neck, scratched patterns in the dirt. Simple but clear drawings showed healthy eggs and the black spreading across them like a disease. Another drawing showed hatchlings emerging then falling still. How long has this been happening? Jack asked, pointing to the drawings and holding up his fingers. The scarred dragon scratched 5 deep lines in the dirt. 5 seasons, Jack translated. No wonder they were desperate. Inside his lab, Jack created a makeshift incubation chamber for the eggs. His equipment wasn't designed for xenobiology research, but he'd have to make it work. Using his portable scanner, he took readings of the infected patches. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, staring at the readouts. Whatever was killing the eggs wasn't bacterial or viral, at least not by Earth standards. It was something else entirely. Through the lab window, Jack noticed the dragons watching him intently. Their confusion was obvious. In their world, healing came from natural remedies, plants and minerals gathered from the environment. Jack had seen them applying mud poultices to wounds. Their world was one of instinct and tradition. But here was this strange, soft-skinned creature, touching their precious eggs with metal objects that blinked with lights. He wasn't gathering healing plants or performing rituals. To them, his actions must have seemed completely alien. "I need to see where you nest," Jack told the elders, using gestures to convey his meaning. "Show me where the eggs are laid." The dragons exchanged looks. Even across species, Jack recognized their hesitation. He was asking to see their most protected place. Finally, the matriarch nodded and made a beckoning motion with her wing. Jack packed his portable equipment and followed the dragons across the plain. They moved slowly, adjusting their natural pace to his human limitations. After several hours of walking, they reached a series of low hills. The landscape changed from open grassland to rocky terrain with strange mushroom-like growths the size of small trees. The nesting grounds lay in a protected valley. Dozens of nests lined the area, each meticulously constructed of woven grasses and lined with shed scales that sparkled in the sunlight. Under normal circumstances, this valley would have been filled with eggs and newly hatched younglings. Now most nests sat empty. The few eggs that remained showed varying degrees of the black infection. Jack carefully collected soil samples, water from a nearby spring, and scrapings from the nest materials. Whatever was causing this had to be environmental. As Jack worked, he noticed a group of younger dragons watching from a distance. Their scales were brighter, their movements more energetic than the elders. They seemed especially interested in his equipment, tilting their heads when lights flashed or screens changed. One brave young dragon approached, sniffing curiously at Jack's sample case. The elders hissed warnings, but Jack held up his hand. "It's okay," he said softly. "Curiosity is good." He slowly opened his case, showing the various instruments inside. The young dragon's pupils widened with interest. Jack demonstrated how the scanner worked, running it over a rock and showing the resulting image on the small screen. The young dragon made a chirping sound that might have been excitement. Soon, others from the younger group approached, all curious about the strange tools. "You know," Jack said, looking at the younger dragons, "this might be what saves your species. This willingness to try something new." Back at his station that night, Jack worked tirelessly, analyzing samples and running tests. The portable lab equipment wasn't designed for this kind of intensive research, frequently overheating and requiring resets. Each failure meant hours of lost work. Outside, the dragons had established a sort of camp. They took turns watching the lab, their massive forms silhouetted against the starlit sky. Jack wondered what they thought of him. This strange creature working through the night, his lab glowing with artificial light when any sensible being would be sleeping. After days of tests with no breakthrough, frustration built. Jack pounded his fist on the lab table, sending vials rattling. "Damn it," he shouted. "I'm missing something obvious." Through the window, he caught the matriarch's amber eyes watching him. In that moment, despite belonging to entirely different evolutionary branches, they shared the same emotion, fear that time was running out. Jack stepped outside into the cool night air. The matriarch approached, her massive form blocking out the stars. "I won't give up," Jack promised, placing his hand against her scaled side. "Whatever's killing your young will find it. Somehow." The matriarch lowered her head until her eye was level with Jack's. In that golden iris he saw something that transcended species, trust, fragile but growing. And with that trust came an enormous responsibility. One human, with limited resources, now carried the future of an entire species in his hands. 3 weeks into his investigation, Jack was no closer to a solution. Each morning the dragons brought more blackened eggs and each night, Jack fell asleep at his workbench, surrounded by failed experiments. Dark circles framed his eyes, and his normally neat beard had grown wild and unkempt. That morning, Jack sat cross-legged outside his station, reviewing data on his tablet while sipping stale coffee. The matriarch approached, dropping something at his feet, a dead fish from the river that ran through the eastern valley. A gift. Thanks, Jack said with a tired smile, setting the fish aside. But I need answers more than food right now. He scrolled through his latest soil analysis results, comparing them to Earth standards. Something caught his eye: trace elements that shouldn't exist naturally in this environment. Jack tapped rapidly on his screen, pulling up geological surveys of Draconis Prime. Wait a minute, he muttered, zooming in on a map. There's something on the other side of those mountains. Jack retrieved his drone from storage, a battered survey model he rarely used. After a quick battery check, he launched it skyward. The dragons watched with fascination as the small machine disappeared over the distant mountain range. Hours later, the drone returned with footage that made Jack's blood run cold. Beyond the mountains lay an industrial complex, or what remained of one. Massive excavators sat abandoned, half buried in shifting sands. Storage tanks, some cracked open, dotted the landscape like massive eggs. Son of a bitch, Jack whispered, zooming in on the faded logo painted on the largest building. Quantum Resource Extraction, a Earth-based mining corporation. They'd been here, stripped what they wanted, and left without proper containment of their chemicals. Jack played back the drone's atmospheric readings. Sure enough, during rainstorms, chemicals from the abandoned site would wash into the groundwater, eventually reaching the rivers that fed the dragon nesting grounds. We did this, Jack said, hands shaking with anger. My own kind did this to you. The matriarch tilted her head, clearly not understanding his sudden rage. How could she comprehend the concept of one species carelessly destroying another's habitat for profit? In the dragon's world, you killed for food or territory, immediate, understandable needs, not for abstract concepts like shareholder value. Jack kicked an empty supply crate, sending it flying. The younger dragons, startled at his outburst, backing away. The matriarch stood her ground, watching with those intelligent amber eyes. I'm sorry, Jack said, forcing himself to calm down. He placed his hand on the matriarch's scaled foreleg. My species did this, and I'll fix it. That night, Jack sent an emergency transmission to Earth's Colonial Oversight Committee, documenting the abandoned mining operation and its effects on native wildlife. The response was predictably bureaucratic. Your report has been received and will be reviewed according to standard protocols. Standard protocols? Jack spat, reading the message. That could take years. He looked out at the dragon herd camping around his station. They didn't have years. They might not even have months. The next morning, Jack loaded his rover with equipment and headed toward the mountains. The matriarch and two younger dragons followed at a distance. The journey took 3 days, crossing harsh terrain the rover wasn't designed for. Twice it got stuck, and each time the dragons watched in apparent confusion as Jack cursed, dug, pushed, and eventually freed the vehicle. When they finally crested the mountain pass and the abandoned mining facility came into view, Jack's suspicions were confirmed. It was worse than the drone footage had shown. The operation had been massive, a strip mining operation that had torn open the earth like a wound. This is what humans do, Jack said bitterly to the dragons who had stopped beside him. We take what we want and leave the mess for others to deal with. The matriarch stared at the alien structures, her nostrils flaring at the strange smells. The younger dragons hissed, sensing the wrongness of this place. Inside the main building, Jack found what he expected: records of hasty evacuation when the planet's rare metals proved less valuable than initially thought. No proper decommissioning, no environmental remediation. Just abandonment. Jack spent days taking samples from the holding tanks and surrounding soil. The chemical compounds were complex: industrial solvents and extraction fluids that had leached into the groundwater. The connection to the dying eggs was clear now. These chemicals disrupted the embryonic development, causing the fatal black patches. Back at his research station, Jack worked with renewed determination. Now that he knew what he was fighting, he could develop a targeted approach. But the scale of the problem was overwhelming. The chemicals had spread throughout the watershed. Neutralizing them all would require resources far beyond what one man possessed. The dragons sensed his renewed energy. They brought him food, fish, and game they had hunted. They took turns keeping watch over his station while he worked. The younger dragons, initially fearful after his angry outburst, now approached again with curiosity, watching him through the windows. Days turned into weeks. Jack tried formula after formula, attempting to create a compound that would neutralize the toxic chemicals without harming the eggs. Each failure was met not with resignation but with immediate recalculation and a new approach. The matriarch watched this process with growing fascination. In her world, failed hunting strategies were quickly abandoned. Failed remedies were not tried again. Yet this small mammal kept trying variations of the same approach, making tiny adjustments each time, refusing to accept defeat. One night, after a particularly frustrating day of failed experiments, Jack sat outside under the stars. The matriarch settled beside him, her massive body radiating heat in the cool night air. "You know what's crazy?" Jack said, looking up at the unfamiliar constellations. "In all our rush to get out here and take what we want, we never stop to wonder what we might be destroying. Your kind has been here for what, millions of years? And in less than a decade, we nearly wiped you out without even realizing it." The matriarch made a low rumbling sound in her chest. "But I'm not giving up," Jack continued, placing his hand on her scaled side. "That's the other thing about humans. When we decide to fix something, we can be just as stubborn as when we're breaking it." The matriarch blinked slowly, and in that moment, despite the vast evolutionary gulf between them, Jack felt truly understood. 2 months into his work, Jack reached a breaking point. Another batch of eggs had turned black overnight, despite his best efforts to neutralize the chemicals in their nesting materials. He sat on the floor of his lab, surrounded by failed formulas and broken equipment, head in his hands. "I can't fix the water," he whispered to himself. "I can't clean the entire ecosystem. Not with what I have here." A tap at the window startled him. The young dragon who had first shown interest in his equipment peered in, its azure eyes curious. Jack stood up, brushing himself off, and went outside where the herd had gathered. The dragon sensed his defeat. The matriarch made a low, questioning sound. Behind her, several females guarded the few remaining healthy eggs, their bodies curled protectively around the precious clutches. Jack looked at them all, these magnificent creatures facing extinction because of human carelessness. A new thought began to form in his mind. If he couldn't fix the environment quickly enough, what if we changed the eggs instead? He said aloud. That night, Jack dug through his research station's storage compartments, pulling out equipment he hadn't used since graduate school. His specialization had been xenobiology with a focus on adaptive genetics, the study of how alien species evolved to survive in hostile environments. He'd never applied those theories practically, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. The next morning he called the matriarch to his lab. Using drawings and gestures, he tried to explain his radical idea, genetically modifying the dragon embryos to resist the toxins. He showed how other species adapted to environmental poisons, how genes could be altered to create new defenses. The matriarch's reaction was immediate and visceral. She reared back, wings extending to their full 30-foot span, a hissing roar escaping her massive jaws. Other dragons responded with similar displays of aggression. To them, Jack was suggesting something unthinkable, changing what they fundamentally were. Jack stood his ground, though his heart pounded painfully in his chest. "I understand," he said calmly, holding the matriarch's gaze. "But the alternative is watching your kind disappear forever." For 3 days the dragons kept their distance. Jack continued working, converting part of his lab into a makeshift genetic engineering facility. He rigged sample analysis equipment to serve new purposes, jury-rigged a primitive CRISPR system using parts from his medical supplies, and wrote new programs to model genetic modifications. On the 4th day the matriarch returned. Alone she approached the lab where Jack worked. Through the window their eyes met. She made a soft trilling sound, then used her wing to point toward a small hollow just visible in the distance. Jack grabbed his field kit and followed her. In the hollow lay a single egg, its shell still vibrantly healthy with no signs of the black infection. The matriarch stepped back, making a pushing motion toward Jack. "One egg," Jack said, understanding flowing through him. "You're trusting me with one." The responsibility settled on him like a physical weight. This wasn't just an experiment, it was a sacred trust. He carefully lifted the egg, cradling it against his chest for the walk back to his lab. "I won't let you down," he promised. Jack worked day and night on the genetic modifications. He extracted DNA from the embryo using a technique gentle enough to leave the egg viable. His computer models showed that with specific changes to certain gene sequences, the embryo could develop enzymes capable of breaking down the toxic chemicals before they damaged development. The procedure itself took 14 hours. Jack's hands cramped from the delicate work, manipulating tools not designed for such precision tasks. He modified the embryonic DNA using viral vectors, targeting specific gene sequences related to metabolic functions. Then, with trembling hands, he resealed the tiny opening in the egg shell using a biological adhesive. The matriarch watched the entire process through the lab window, never moving, barely seeming to breathe. For 5 days, nothing changed. The egg sat in its incubation chamber, looking no different than before. Jack barely slept, checking readings constantly for any sign of rejection or failure. On the 6th day, something extraordinary happened. When exposed to a sample of the contaminated water, the egg shell didn't develop the telltale black patches. Instead, it glowed slightly brighter as though actively fighting the toxins. "It's working," Jack whispered, hardly daring to believe it. He called the matriarch inside the lab, showing her the egg and the contaminated water sample. She lowered her massive head, nostrils flaring as she inspected the egg. Jack activated his instruments, projecting magnified images showing the egg cells actively breaking down the toxic compounds. The matriarch made a sound Jack had never heard before, almost like singing, a melodic trill that rose and fell. Outside, other dragons took up the call, the sound echoing across the plains. Word spread quickly among the herd. Dragons gathered around the research station, trying to peer through windows and doors. Jack moved his equipment outside so more could witness the miracle of the resistant egg. With the matriarch's permission, Jack began treating more eggs. Each clutch required days of careful work, but with each success, his techniques improved. He taught the younger dragons to help with simple tasks, preparing solutions, monitoring equipment, bringing him materials when needed. Their dexterous tail tips, while not as precise as human hands, proved surprisingly adept at manipulating larger objects. One evening, as Jack worked on his 8th batch of eggs, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The young dragon assisting him was mimicking his movements, not just following instructions. When Jack adjusted a dial, the dragon watched intently, then used its tail tip to adjust a similar dial on another piece of equipment. When Jack mixed solutions in specific ratios, the dragon observed and then attempted to do the same. "You're learning," Jack said with amazement. "Not just following, actually understanding." The dragon made a soft chirping sound, its azure eyes fixed on Jack's hands as he continued working. That night, as Jack finally took a break to eat, the matriarch approached him. She carried something in her mouth, a small crystal that glowed with an inner light. She placed it at Jack's feet, then backed away, lowering her head in what could only be interpreted as reverence. The other dragons followed suit, each bringing small offerings, unusual stones, rare flowers, intricate nest-weaving materials. Jack realized with humbling clarity what was happening. To these creatures he wasn't just a helpful alien anymore. He had become something their evolutionary experience had never prepared them for, a savior who changed the very essence of their being to ensure their survival. As the dragons performed what could only be described as a ceremony around him, Jack felt the weight of what he had done. He had forever altered their species' path. But looking at the healthy eggs glowing in their incubation chambers, he knew it had been the right choice. The great hatching began as Draconis Prime's twin suns aligned in the sky, bathing the nesting grounds in golden light. Jack stood with the dragon elders, heart pounding with equal parts excitement and terror. After 3 months of genetic modifications and careful monitoring, the moment of truth had arrived. The first egg rocked gently, hairline cracks spreading across its iridescent surface. The entire herd fell silent, hundreds of scaled bodies perfectly still, watching. Jack held his breath as a small section of shell pushed outward, then fell away. A tiny snout poked through, glistening with embryonic fluid. The hatchling squeaked, pushing harder against its shell. More pieces fell away until, with a final determined shove, the baby dragon tumbled into the world. "It's healthy," Jack whispered, joy flooding through him. The hatchling was perfect, scales gleaming with that distinctive blue-green sheen, eyes clear and alert, tiny wings unfurling as it took its first breaths. The matriarch approached cautiously, sniffing the newborn. She made the singing trill that Jack now recognized as their sound of celebration. All across the nesting grounds, more eggs began to hatch. Each emergence brought the same result, healthy hatchlings, free from the black sickness that had nearly destroyed their kind. Dragons roared their approval, wings extended in displays of pure joy. Jack moved through the nesting grounds, checking each hatchling with his scanner. All showed the modified gene sequences working perfectly, breaking down the toxic compounds that had poisoned previous generations. But as he examined the third clutch to hatch, Jack noticed something unexpected. The hatchling's front claws were different, slightly longer, more flexible, and with an additional joint that allowed them to curve inward. A completely unplanned side effect of the genetic modifications. Well, that's interesting, Jack muttered, gently lifting a hatchling's front leg for closer inspection. The baby dragon chirped, then did something that made Jack nearly drop his scanner. It gripped his finger with those modified claws, using them almost like thumbs. No way, Jack breathed. Throughout the day, as more hatchlings emerged, the pattern became clear. Every modified dragon had developed these proto-thumbs, a completely unexpected evolutionary leap. And they were using them instinctively, grasping nesting materials, picking up small objects, even trying to manipulate the pieces of their own eggshells. By nightfall, the elders had gathered to witness this miracle. Jack tried to explain what had happened, that this change had been accidental, a side effect of the genes he'd modified to fight the toxins. I didn't plan this, he told the matriarch, who watched a hatchling stack small stones with its new dexterous claws. But it might be the most important change of all. Over the following weeks, Jack observed the hatchlings developing at an astonishing rate. They grew quickly, as all reptilian species did, but it was their behavior that truly amazed him. They didn't just use their new appendages, they seemed driven to experiment with them, constantly manipulating objects, building simple structures, even attempting to use sticks as basic tools. One morning, Jack found several hatchlings outside his lab, attempting to press buttons on an equipment panel he'd left outside. They scattered when they saw him, but their intention was clear. They were trying to use his technology. You understand, don't you? Jack said to the matriarch as she watched the young ones play. This changes everything for your species. The dragons had always been intelligent, but without the physical ability to manipulate their environment precisely, that intelligence had natural limits. These hatchlings represented a new chapter, the beginning of what might someday become a technological civilization. As the second month after hatching came to a close, Jack received the message he'd been both expecting and dreading. The Colonial Oversight Committee had finally reviewed his report on the abandoned mining facility. They were sending a cleanup crew, and recalling Jack to Earth for debriefing. That night, Jack walked among the herd, watching the young dragons play. They had nearly doubled in size already, their new dexterous claws allowing games of increasing complexity. Some had learned to weave grasses into simple shapes. Others had discovered they could use sticks to dig more efficiently. I have to leave soon, Jack told the matriarch as she joined him on a hilltop overlooking the plains. My people are coming to clean up the poison. They'll finish what I started. The matriarch made a low, mournful sound. She understood, even if the concept of other humans coming was foreign to her. Jack had shown her the message on his tablet, explained as best he could that more of his kind would arrive to help. The next morning, the entire herd gathered around Jack's research station. The elders formed a circle, with Jack and the matriarch in the center. What followed was clearly a ceremony of great significance. One by one the elders approached, each placing a scale shed from their own body at Jack's feet. The scales formed a glittering circle around him, catching the sunlight like jewels. The matriarch then stepped forward, lowering her massive head until her snout touched Jack's forehead. A young dragon, the curious one who had first shown interest in Jack's equipment, approached carrying something in its newly dexterous claws, a crude necklace made of woven grasses, strung with small crystals and dragon scales. Jack knelt as the young dragon placed the necklace around his neck. The meaning was clear even without words. He was being adopted into the herd, honored as one of their own. Thank you, Jack said, voice thick with emotion. I'll never forget any of you. On his last day, as Jack packed his research station for evacuation, he heard commotion outside. The hatchlings had gathered and they were building something. Using their new proto-thumbs, they stacked stones into a rough pyramid shape. When finished, they backed away, looking to Jack for approval. Your first monument, Jack said, touching the crude structure gently. And certainly not your last. As his transport ship descended from the clouds, Jack stood with the matriarch on the same hill where he'd first spotted the dragon herd nearly a year earlier. Behind them, the young dragons continued their building and experimentation, their excited chirps carrying on the wind. You'll be fine now, Jack told her. Better than fine. You might just end up building your own ship someday. The matriarch made that now familiar singing trill, then gently nudged Jack toward the waiting ship with her snout. It wasn't goodbye, they both understood that. It was more like until next time. As the transport lifted off, Jack pressed his face to the viewport, watching the dragons grow smaller below. The matriarch remained on the hilltop, her massive wings spread in a final salute. Around her neck glinted Jack's parting gift, his old university medallion on a simple chain. From high above, Jack could see the changes already beginning. The hatchlings had arranged stones to mark territories. They had built shelters more complex than any natural dragon nest. One group was even attempting to dam a small stream with carefully arranged logs. Jack smiled as the clouds enveloped the viewport. He had come to study an alien species but had ended up changing their evolutionary path forever. And they, in turn, had changed him. In the ship's small cabin, Jack opened his tablet and began typing. Field report, Draconis Prime Dragons Year 1 of the Tool Age. The humans back on Earth would want to know about the chemical cleanup, the successful genetic intervention, the unexpected mutations. But what they really needed to understand was the more profound lesson. That sometimes, the most important thing one species can give another isn't technology or science or even survival. Sometimes it's simply a new way of seeing what's possible.